Welcome back. If you could all take your seats, we're ready to get started. Just a word, those of you who are expecting Nikhil's performance right now, you have to sit through this panel first. The performance will start at 4:45, but before that we have a panel on the archive. And just to say that you will notice on your programs that we have these four categories: practice, archive, pedagogy, and support. And these are actually, I guess, areas of focus that emerge from our earlier discussions in stepping away, and they have formed a sort of loose framework for stepping forward. So this panel in particular will look at three different positions on the archive. And we're looking through the curatorial, the art historical, and the practice-led. And, you know, in our conversations as we were planning this event, we've talked a lot about both the need for the archive and also the resistance to easily accessible archives. So they will come up in terms of practice, but also in terms of research around performance. I'll introduce each presentation as they start so that you remember the information. And we will begin with Eva Bentcheva, who is an art historian and curator and a lecturer who is currently at Heidelberg University, but has been involved in research fellowships after her PhD at SOAS, looking specifically at South and Southeast Asia and Europe, and with a real focus on performance practice. Eva will be talking today about performative documentation, archival departure, reflecting specifically on an exhibition project at Haus der Kunst, which was looking at practice in Southeast Asia and developing an exhibition about performance through archival research. So over to you.
Okay. This on? Thank you very much for the introduction, Nada. I want to begin today by saying a big thank you to Nada and Maze, Joanna, Bradine, and Fatima, as well as the whole team here at 421 for the invitation to speak and putting together this very impressive program. So, archives. It's exactly the right topic to have after lunch. So, I'll try and make this a bit more engaging for you. Like Nada mentioned, I'm an art historian who comes mainly from the visual arts. So when I research performance art, I always have to ask myself the question of what exactly is performance art for me? And I have a working definition for myself. For me, performance art is action or interaction in the context of the visual arts. So I'm going to speak today about an exhibition which I co-curated several years back. It's a different type of talk from the ones that I normally give, which have a more art historical focus and look at the artworks. For me, as somebody who's a scholar but occasionally curates, I can't help but also be self-critical in the process and try and glean more questions from the exhibitions than I'm ever able to answer. But for all of us here, we're here today because we're interested in performance art. And in that process, we've likely read a lot of literature. And the question of documentation is always one that carries on coming up. We have iconic writers on the topic. Peggy Phelan, for example, insists the documentation is a supplement to the live artwork. Amelia Jones tells us that documentation, in contrast, is a very integral part of the live performance. Philip Auslander tells us that performance from the very beginning has had an eye towards photography and film, and the list goes on, and the debate continues. Now we live in a time in which for the several years there's been a real institutional thrust to also gather and document and archive works of performance art. But what happens when the art historical context of this documentation, and I stress here that I'm dealing with the documentation, not the artwork. What happens when the art historical context of the documentation and how it came to be is far away, or in some cases also unknown? To what extent should we also be telling that second story of how the documentation came to be? This was for a long time the reality of performance art from Southeast Asia in the UK, where I worked for many years. As a researcher, there were few resources to tap into, and so I was very fortunate when around the time of 2013, 2015, I crossed paths with another colleague who comes from Singapore. Her name is Annie Jael Kwan, who was an independent curator, curating performances which were collaborations between Southeast Asian artists and artists working in the UK. And Annie at the time had had the idea to actually create an archive of performance art from Southeast Asia in the UK and make it available as a research resource. She'd managed to get together with her co-organizer of the independent curatorial initiative called Something Human. They had managed to get funding and approached the Live Art Development Agency. For those of you who don't know what that is, in London, the Live Art Development Agency is an independent organization responsible particularly for educating about the theme of live art and promoting new works that come out of that research. So Something Human had approached the Live Art Development Agency and asked whether, if they were able to independently create an archive of Southeast Asian performance art, would they be willing to be a host for it and have it on their digital servers and available as a research resource, which they agreed to. So with limited funding, the gathering started. It happened primarily in 4 countries: Cambodia, Vietnam, Singapore, and the Philippines. And this is where I come in, because a lot of my research deals with the Philippines, post-war art, post-independence, conceptual and performance art in particular. And so I headed up the team which was responsible for getting documentation of performances from the Philippines. By 2017, when we opened the archive at the Live Art Development Agency, it was a digital repository of over 50 artists and 27,000 serial and individual performance documentations, which were hosted on the servers of the Live Art Development Agency. I would like to say a little bit about the archiving process, because this archive was not put together as a matter of personal or institutional taste, like a lot of archives are. It was not meant to represent a canon of Southeast Asia either. Rather, it was an archive of documentation formed through the process of gift-giving and friendship networks and introductions and generosity and people reaching out to their networks who in turn then went on to reach out to more networks, and then it all fed back. The scholar Sven Speaker refers to this as an after-archive. Archives in the age of social media, which are built through long-distance networks and digital exchanges. The Southeast Asia Performance Archive, in this sense, was also a living archive. Most of the contributing artists were not only still alive, but they were still practicing and creating new works. So this was an incomplete archive as well, or as we like to refer it, an archive of futuring. And in 2018, an opportunity came up to start working with this archive, even though it was still very much incomplete. I received a fellowship at Haus der Kunst in Munich. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Haus der Kunst, in Germany, it's a very famous exhibition space. It's not a museum because it doesn't have a collection of its own. But it has a history that goes back to 1937, during the time of National Socialism, during which it was built as a monumental architecture to be the house of German art. So it has a history that is both archival but is also very performative. If you Google this institution, you will find online photos of politicians from the Nationalist Socialist times parading through it, staging enactments, staging speeches within this space. And when I joined in 2018, the director there was Okwi Nwezor. Okwi had been in the process of realizing a large-scale 3-part exhibition project with other colleagues. The first part of it had just closed. That was the exhibition Post-War, Art Between the Pacific and the Atlantic. Another 2 projects were in the planning. The first one was called the Post-Colonial Constellation, and the final one was to be on post-communism. I was brought on board to work towards the Post-Colonial Constellation and contribute research on contemporary art from Southeast Asia in the decolonial and post-independence period. However, as fate sometimes has it, I signed my contract, and several days later, Okwi's time as director of Haus der Kunst came to a very abrupt end. So all of a sudden, it was a very large institution without a lead, partially on autopilot. But within that gap of the program, there was also an opportunity to work precisely with the Southeast Asia Performance Collection, because Haus der Kunst had not only gallery spaces, but actually it had an archive gallery. This was a single room, which on the one hand, you'll see it has a chronology of Haus der Kunst's history, drawing upon images from its own archive, but then it also has an inner space, which is designed specifically to invite independently developed archives to be curated within the space and reflect the structures of that archive. So I approached colleagues at Haus der Kunst, and we were able to invite Annie Jael Kwan, the founder of the Southeast Asia Performance Collection, to join us and together to think about how we can translate a digital archive of performance art sitting on a computer in London and bring it over to Munich. There were a number of difficult choices which we had to make in the very beginning. First of all, there was the question of knowledge, or rather lack of knowledge, around Southeast Asian modern and contemporary art in Germany, coupled at the time with a very strong pressure from the side of the museum to make exhibitions which would speak specifically to local audiences within Munich. Then there was the question of selection. How to make a selection from these 27,000 works of documentation, which would at once be representative but without claiming completion. How to resist speaking for the entire region of Southeast Asia. Remember, at the time, there was only 4 countries represented in that archive. But in the process to highlight individual and national histories and common threads. And most importantly, how to reflect on the nature of that documentation through the form of an exhibition. Documentation which in some cases was partial, low resolution, fragmented images and videos, some of them already partially published online on artists' social media, available through different channels. And on top of everything, this was an archive created through networks and was digital. At the time, the archive was not available open access online through the Live Art Development Agency. So our initial idea to actually create a parallel archive which could be available in its entirety and be accessed from the exhibition space in Munich was an idea which was our first impulse in a way. And I share an anecdote here that I have to laugh and look back, because we met with the technical team at the time and said, we would like to create this alternative database, and we would like to have QR codes in the exhibition space where the audience can go in, scan maybe an image, and go into the archive in its entire form. And the technical team at the time said, forget it, QR codes are far too complicated for our audiences. They'll never use them. This was 2019. How the future would change. But so without that option on the table, we took perhaps a more conventional approach. We went back to Okwi's idea of the constellation. Rather than contesting the Haus der Kunst chronology on the other side, we decided to mirror it in a way and show that the world is constellated sometimes in parallel and unexpected ways. We wanted the grid structure, at least to attempt to represent the digital nature of the archive. And we decided to also show video documentation rather than photography in this case, to highlight the performative aspect of the work, but also really to get at the common threads between the artworks. We had 3 curated categories, and these are really topics where, listening over the last 2 days, I find there's so much resonances, which the talks yesterday especially had. One of our categories, for example, was the aesthetics and politics of publicness. We made a conscious choice here not to speak about the public, and equate it with an audience, but rather to think about how performance actually is a reflection on what it means to put yourself within a public space, to interact with the city, with the society, and to have that reflection then come back onto you. Another section that we had was contestations and constructions of identity rather than expressions of identity. This is something else that the discussions yesterday surfaced. And the final section was that of the archival reenactment. Throughout different parts of Southeast Asia, as archives of contemporary art and also documentation is shared, the archive actually comes to be a creative resource which is used over and over again by artists. But because this was a living archive and we only wanted the archive to be the point of departure, we also included a performance program of a live performance by the Cambodian-American artist Anida Yu Ali. And here I show you a photograph of the Buddhist bug, a work that she staged in many different parts of the world, but which reflects on the tensions between her Muslim and, to some extent, also Buddhist spiritual belief in her own background. Anida staged a live performance which, in a lighthearted way, also brought in audiences for the opening and introduced them to some of the ideas which the exhibition was working with. And I just want to share a quick snapshot that the Buddhist bug was not only a head, it had also feet. And we were very fortunate to have the now quite famous German-Vietnamese artist Song Thieu play the feet of the bug in 2019. Also accompanying this was a symposium alongside which we had two more performances. One was by Ho Rui-an, with whom we have the pleasure to share the space today and whom you saw earlier, and the Filipino-British artist Noella de Leon, who also staged a live performance. I would really love to have the time to go into each of these works individually with you, but this is not what I'm here today. I'm here to tease out some of the biggest questions which came out for me throughout the exhibition. If we are indeed to think of the archive of performance art as a point of departure, yes, we can have themes. We can have themes which give us maybe a thematic snapshot of certain concerns and practices that are shared across a region. We can also add a living component to it. We can reflect the fact that it's a living archive also by incorporating live performances. But something troubled me. Was I using this archive as a source of representation? Was this sufficient? Was the archive itself maybe also not performative in some ways? Over the last few years, I've become increasingly interested in this blurring between the artwork and the archive. Can there be a form of documentation which is not photographic, video-based audio, or, as Rebecca Schneider prominently calls it, a performance remains? What is the role of voice in this? And this is something I think that's going to connect quite well later on to the talk that Lawrence is going to give. I had to think back to Okwi's essay, The Production of Social Space as Artwork, from 2007, in which he says that the collective voice is something that is incredibly difficult to tease out in an artwork, but that is absolutely essential for us to look to. So now I'm in the process of planning my next show, which is dealing with artist-created archives and the role of voice within those archives. And I'm just giving you a snapshot of one of the works that's featured within this, and this has a very wonderful parallel to the performance also that Ahilan gave yesterday, working with plants. This was an exhibition shown at Documenta this year. It's a collection of illegally imported Vietnamese plants into Germany and Taiwan, which the artist gains in their original form from their owners. The plants in themselves here are the archive of the stories of the people who brought them. They exist usually in people's homes, hidden from the public eye, and to gain the trust necessary to actually have them give them to you as an artist, either to transplant or to exhibit, the trust and the social and collective understanding of history is enormous. For me, the plants in this case also represent a different form of archival thinking, one that's based on collective voice rather than representation, and stories which get left out in the background, but which you have to engage with the performative process to understand. And here's just finally some snapshots of the work as it was shown in Documenta. It's available to Vietnamese communities in Germany to be harvested. There are the seeds as well coming out of it. And one final archive-like image to leave you with, but I finish on that note. Okay.
Thank you, Eva, and thank you for leaving us with images of this ever-traveling archive.